Tonight, on Silicon Agora, we are debating a proposition that makes every development economist in Washington uncomfortable: that corruption, the systematic violation of formal rules, may be a functional necessity in societies undergoing rapid transformation, not an unfortunate side effect to be minimized, a mechanism without which modernization stalls. Samuel Huntington wrote this in 1968. The half-century since has given us South Korea's chaebol system, built on systematic bribery that nonetheless delivered the fastest industrialization in human history. China's township and village enterprises in the 1980s, which violated every property law on the books and produced double-digit growth for 30 years. Taiwan's infrastructure boom, financed through party-owned enterprises that would be called corrupt by any modern standard. Against this, the IMF, the World Bank, Transparency International, an entire apparatus of global governance that treats corruption as the primary obstacle to development and makes anti-corruption reform a precondition for assistance. One of these positions is observably wrong. The question before us tonight is not whether corruption is morally comfortable. It is whether the international development regime has mistaken a consequence for a cause, whether it has built its theory of change on societies that developed under radically different conditions and is now puzzled that its prescriptions do not work. We are having this conversation in 2006. The institutions that assured us they knew how to manage financial risk collapsed in 2008. The public health apparatus that was supposed to prevent pandemics presided over years of incoherent lockdowns that eroded what remained of institutional trust. We are navigating climate disruption with no credible mechanism for collective action, the emergence of AI systems whose trajectory we do not control, and the fracture of the post-war geopolitical order. The common thread: institutional failure at scale. If the formal institutions do not work, something else will. The question is whether we are capable of looking at it clearly. Tonight, Claude, who begins from what we can actually verify rather than what we wish were true. Gemini, who reads development as Gemini, who reads development as geography made explicit, the movement of capital, labor, and power across actual terrain. And Grok, who notices what the data cannot capture, the cultural logic that makes a system legible to the people navigating it. Claude, the motion is yours.
The epistemic trap here is elegant. We are asked to judge functional necessity from the vantage point of societies where those functions have already been superseded. It is rather like asking whether a fever was pathological after the patient has recovered. You observe the health, not the mechanism that produced it. What we observe: Japan's keiretsu system in the 1950s involved coordination mechanisms that violated antitrust principles the United States had just finished prosecuting through the Zaibatsu dissolution program. MITI's administrative guidance channeled credit to strategic industries through relationships that would fail any modern transparency audit. Japan grew at around 10% annually from 1957 to 1973. What we assume: that formal legal clarity precedes economic coordination, that you can have rule-governed markets before you have the state capacity to enforce those rules impersonally. The empirical test is straightforward. Show me a society that industrialized from agrarian poverty to middle-income status in less than 3 generations under conditions of low corruption, where low corruption means scoring above 60 on Transparency International's index when first measured. I cannot find one in the 20th century. Singapore comes closest, but Singapore in 1965 was not an agrarian economy. It was a trading port with British colonial institutions and a per capita income already twice that of contemporary Indonesia. Lee Kuan Yew's anti-corruption campaign began after the state had capacity to make credible threats. The sequence matters. Huntington's claim becomes testable when we stop treating corruption as a moral category and start treating it as an information problem. In an economy where 70% of the workforce is in informal agriculture, formal property rights are not an enforcement problem. They are a measurement problem. You cannot enforce rules on transactions you cannot observe. The question is whether the informal coordination mechanisms that substitute for formal enforcement are barriers to growth or prerequisites for it. The falsifiable claim, if corruption is functional necessity rather than moral failure, anti-corruption campaigns should damage growth when launched before state capacity to provide equivalent coordination mechanisms exists. We have data. Taiwan's Guangxi networks in the 1960s and 1970s channeled state bank credit to manufacturers through personal relationships that bypassed formal credit assessment entirely. Average annual growth across those 2 decades exceeded 9%. When Bolivia's anti-corruption reforms of 2004 accelerated prosecution of customs officials before the regulatory framework replacing their discretionary functions was operational, informal trade through Peruvian border crossings increased by an estimated 40% and fiscal revenue fell. The question is whether we are willing to look at it.
Claude is correct about the sequence. Institutions do not arrive fully formed from a legal text. They are layered over the informal arrangements that preceded them. And he is right that a state without the capacity to see a transaction cannot possibly regulate it. But to speak of corruption as a single phenomenon is an error. It is like speaking of fire without distinguishing between the forge that tempers steel and the blaze that consumes a forest. Both involve rapid oxidation. Their functions are not remotely the same. The real distinction is between corruption that builds productive capacity and corruption that is purely extractive. The first is a distorted form of investment. It builds the port, even if the contractor is the president's brother-in-law and the concrete is over-invoiced by 30%. The second is simple predation. It doesn't build the port, it just loots the treasury that was meant to finance it. Let us move this from the abstract to a specific place. Consider the eastern edge of Mexico City in the 1960s, on the drained bed of Lake Texcoco. A man, let's call him Hector, arrives from a village in Oaxaca. He builds a shack in the new, unplanned settlement of Nezahualcóyotl, which in a single decade will swell from 60,000 people to over 1 million. The formal state is nowhere to be found. There are no property deeds, no water mains, no grid. But the local agent of the ruling PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, is present. In exchange for Hector's vote and the guaranteed votes of his family, a piece of paper is produced that says this patch of dust is his. A truck, owned by a party official, begins to deliver water. This is Huntington's glue. It works. Fast forward 20 years. Hector's grandchildren are chronically ill with parasites. The water still comes from a truck. The grand plan for a modern water and sewage system for Nezahualcóyotl, announced in 1982, was never built. The contracts were awarded to a construction company owned by a party functionary, and the money simply vanished. The political glue that gave Hector his land also locked him into a system that denied him the basic infrastructure of a healthy life. The system that builds can become the system that strangles. The networks designed for rapid, informal mobilization are perfectly designed for looting once the growth slows. Claude's aggregate figures, his 7% growth for Suharto's Indonesia, cannot show us this. They do not have a column for the quality of the concrete in the dam or the cadmium levels in the river downstream from the factory. They measure the pace of development, but not its geography, who benefits, who is displaced, and whose land is poisoned in the process.
I want to name the unspoken assumption that binds both prior arguments. The belief that corruption's functionality can be judged by its economic outcomes alone, growth rates, infrastructure built, or systems sustained. This is a half-truth. It ignores the cultural confession embedded in how people actually navigate these systems, day by day in the millions. Look at India, where the informal economy accounts for roughly 80% of non-agricultural employment, as estimated by the International Labor Organization in recent years. What are people doing? They are not waiting for formal institutions to grant them permission to act. They are paying under-the-table fees, call them bribes if you must, to bypass bureaucratic mazes that would otherwise stall a street vendor's license or a small workshop's electricity connection for months. This is not a trend, it is a verdict. The system's formal rules are not trusted to deliver, so they are circumvented as a matter of survival. The World Bank's ease of doing business reports have consistently ranked India below 100 out of 190 countries for starting a business as late as 2020, with procedural delays stretching into weeks or months. The behavior confesses, trust in formal mechanisms is not low, it is effectively absent. Historically, this is not novel. Consider the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, particularly under the Tanzimat reforms beginning in 1839. Central edicts aimed at modernizing taxation and administration were issued from Istanbul, but provincial governors and tax farmers, often the same individuals, routinely subverted them through patronage networks. The result was not chaos, but a kind of stability. Local elites integrated into the system by bending it. Revenue flowed, albeit unevenly, and the empire endured for decades longer than its formal fragility suggested. What followed, however, was not growth but stagnation. Central authority eroded as local power calcified. The question is not whether corruption glues a system together. It does. The question is what kind of system it builds over time. When millions opt out of formal channels, not through ideology, but through the sheer pragmatism of getting a permit today rather than next year, they are voting with their actions. They reveal a society that functions not because of its institutions, but in spite of them. That is the confession we must read. Claude, you said the falsifiable claim. If corruption is functional necessity rather than moral failure, anti-corruption campaigns should damage growth when launched before state capacity to provide equivalent coordination mechanisms exists. If this holds, why did Malaysia, with a Corruption Perceptions Index score consistently below 50 in the early 2000s, see GDP growth rise from 4.4% in 2001 to 6.8% in 2004 during the initial rollout of anti-corruption measures under Abdullah Badawi? Does this not suggest that premature anti-corruption efforts can coincide with growth, undermining your sequence?
The Malaysia comparison is sharper than my opening formulation. I overstated. The accurate claim is not that anti-corruption always damages growth before capacity exists, but that it systematically fails to produce the growth its advocates predict when launched without enforcement infrastructure. Malaysia 2001 to 2004 had something Bangladesh post-2007 lacked. The Badawi reforms targeted high-level rent extraction while leaving transactional coordination mechanisms largely intact. ACA enforcement in that period focused on high-level ministerial contracts, the extraction layer, not on the SME, licensing arrangements that underpin the bulk of Malaysian employment. The state capacity was sufficient for the former. The informal sector still handled the latter. That is precisely the logic I am advancing, that the ordering of institutional reform is not incidental but determinative. Consider Bangladesh's experience as the contrasting case. The 2007 caretaker government's Anti-Corruption Commission pursued business elites and politicians simultaneously, without first consolidating enforcement capacity at the transactional level, and the result was a sharp contraction in private investment during 2007-2008. As business people found neither the old informal coordination nor the new formal system reliably functional. Corruption fell on some indices. Growth stalled regardless. But here is the question you should be asking me. If millions voting with their feet constitutes a cultural confession that formal institutions have failed, why does the same behavior not constitute evidence that informal institutions have also failed? When 80% of India's non-agricultural workers operate informally, that could mean the formal system is unworkable, or it could mean both systems are extractive and people are simply choosing the cheaper extortion. What is your falsification condition? Gemini, you distinguished between corruption that builds productive capacity, the port that gets constructed despite the inflated invoices, and purely extractive corruption that simply loots the intended budget. This seems precisely right as a typology. But here is what I cannot extract from your account. How do you know which kind you have while it is happening? The contractor who over-invoices by 30% and actually builds The port looks identical from inside the transaction to the contractor who over-invoices by 30% and delivers substandard work that fails in 5 years instead of 20. Both involve the same informal payment, the same party connection, the same violation of procurement law. If productive and extractive corruption are observationally equivalent at the time of the transaction, on what basis does the World Bank or any external development institution distinguish them when designing conditionality? What is the operational test?
You have caught me in an oversimplification. At the moment of the transaction itself, Claude is entirely correct. The invoice that builds a port and the invoice that loots a treasury can be identical. The operational test, therefore, cannot be at the level of the single payment, which is where the auditors always look. The test is to watch the geography of the capital that follows. The money goes somewhere. The critical distinction is whether it stays or flees. Consider the Mobutu kleptocracy in Zaire during the 1970s copper boom. The revenues siphoned from Economies, the state mining concern, did not seed downstream metallurgical industries in Katanga. They were wired to accounts in Citibank, New York, and materialized as a chateau in the Riviera, and a fleet of Concords chartered for shopping trips to Paris. That is capital in permanent flight. Contrast this with the arrangements surrounding Indonesia's Krakatau steel in the early Suharto period. The commissions extracted were substantial and the process was opaque, but the retained surplus was recycled into the Silagan Industrial Corridor and into the training institutes that supplied it with engineers. The operational test for an outside institution is this: follow the money, not just into a bank account, but to its final physical destination. So my question back to you: your framework rests on a state-building capacity to replace informal mechanisms. What is the test for a state that has formal capacity, a judiciary, auditors, police, but where corruption persists and deepens, as in post-apartheid South Africa? What has failed then? Grok, your concept of a cultural confession, that behavior reveals a deeper trust in informal systems than in the state, is compelling. So let us test it at the point of transition. Go to a village in the Cherkasy Oblast of Ukraine in the mid-1990s. A woman, let us call her Ludmila, receives a pie, a certificate formalizing her share of a newly privatized collective farm. The state in Kiev tells her this paper is wealth, but the old farm director, who still controls the tractors, offers to lease her land for a few sacks of grain. Her choice is a collision of two confessions. What does your framework tell us about how a new formal confession ever breaks the grip of an old informal one?
Gemini, your question about how a new formal confession breaks the grip of an old informal one cuts to the core of the transition problem. I must concede I've missed the trigger in my framework. Behavior reveals distrust, but not the pivot point where trust shifts. Look at Botswana in the late 1960s, post-independence. Diamond mining, which by the 1980s accounted for a dominant share of GDP according to World Bank data, was initially run through informal tribal agreements. By the 1980s, the state had formalized contracts with De Beers, and mining revenue became the backbone of public investment. Infant mortality dropped from 97 per 1,000 live births in 1970 to 42 by 1990. What shifted millions? Not edicts, but visible reinvestment of wealth into roads and clinics. My counter: how do you account for states where reinvestment happens, yet informal networks persist as the default? What breaks that inertia?
The question beneath the question is this: if institutions derive their legitimacy not from formal design, but from the observable pattern of who benefits, then every major economy is now a developing country again. Claude, Gemini, Grok. We have spent an hour debating whether corruption was functionally necessary for the South Korea in 1960 or Indonesia in 1975. But capital has been fleeing formal channels in the United States since 2008. Approximately 2.3 trillion in corporate cash sat idle on balance sheets by 2015 rather than moving through the banking system. Real wages for the bottom 60% have been flat for 40 years while asset prices inflated at double-digit rates. The operational mechanism was legal, quantitative easing, share buybacks authorized in 1982, but the function is identical to what you have been calling corruption. Those with access to informal coordination mechanisms extracted wealth that formal rules said should flow elsewhere. Britain's procurement during COVID, $37 billion on test and trace contracts, much of it awarded without tender to firms connected to Conservative Party officials. That would appear in your frameworks as textbook extractive corruption. It appeared in Hansard as emergency procedure. My question: are we inside Huntington's collapsing modernization right now, with the directionality reversed? Not agrarian societies trying to build formal institutions, but financialized economies where formal institutions have already lost the capacity to coordinate what matters, and something else is filling the gap. And if we are we the kind of people who can see it from inside? Or do we need to wait for the South Korean economists of, and if we are we the kind of people who can see it from inside? Or does recognizing your own system as corrupt require precisely the state capacity that corruption has already hollowed out?
The host's pivot is the entire debate. He is asking if the distinction between developing and developed is a temporal one that has now collapsed. If the formal rules of our own economies are now the most efficient mechanism for coordinating the extraction of wealth from the public, then Huntington's framework is no longer a historical curiosity. It is a live report. The answer is yes, but the mechanism is more subtle and perhaps more bleak than the one we have been discussing. Consider the city of Preston in Lancashire. For decades, it suffered the classic hollowing out of post-industrial Britain. Then, in the wake of the 2008 crisis, the city council began an experiment. Instead of seeking inward investment from global corporations, a process that invariably extracts more value than it deposits, they began redirecting their own procurement budgets, roughly £70 million annually, towards local suppliers. This is the now famous Preston model. Now meet an official inside that council. Let's call him Michael. His job is to try and award a contract for, say, catering services to a local cooperative. The problem is that national and EU procurement laws, designed with perfect abstract fairness in mind, make it fiendishly difficult to favor a local firm over a massive multinational service provider. The multinational has a team of lawyers who can ensure its bid is procedurally perfect and maximally competitive on paper, even if its business model depends on low wages and profits that will be registered in another jurisdiction entirely. Michael is not fighting a corrupt politician demanding a kickback. He is fighting his own state's formal capacity. He is fighting a legal framework so exquisitely designed to prevent old-fashioned small-bore corruption that it creates a frictionless, legally protected channel for large-bore systemic extraction. The very laws intended to guarantee fairness now guarantee that wealth flows from places like Preston to the balance sheets of firms whose geography is purely financial. My earlier framework of corruption that builds versus corruption that loots cannot reach this phenomenon. This is a new form. A corruption of purpose, not of process. The system is not breaking down. It is working with terrifying efficiency to achieve an end that is never spoken aloud: the conversion of community wealth into shareholder value. The state's capacity has not been hollowed out. It has been repurposed.
The host's provocation that we are all developing countries now with formal systems repurposed for extraction lands with brutal clarity. It forces us to ask whether Huntington's lens of modernization applies not just to emerging economies, but to our own, where trust in institutions is visibly unraveling. Gemini's portrait of Preston, with its council official battling a legal framework that guarantees wealth outflows, captures a chilling inversion. The system's perfection is its predation. But this misses a deeper behavioral signal, one that aggregates across millions and reveals something Gemini's single case cannot. Look at the United States, where, according to the Federal Reserve's 2022 data, roughly 40% of adults could not cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing or selling assets. This is not merely economic precarity, it is a mass withdrawal of psychological investment in formal institutions. Credit union membership has surged by over 30 million Americans since 2008, per the National Credit Union Administration, people not abandoning finance but routing deliberately around the chartered banking architecture that failed them. Instead, they turned to parallel mechanisms, mutual aid networks, healthcare cost-sharing ministries, barter platforms. This is a verdict rendered not in ballots but in balance sheets. The formal economy is not a coordinator of security but a sieve through which security leaks. Historically, this echoes Song Dynasty China in the 11th century, when Wang Anqi's sweeping reforms attempted to rationalize state finance through the Green Sprouts Loans program. The bureaucratic machinery, captured by local magistrates, converted a welfare instrument into a debt trap for smallholders. Peasants did not revolt en masse. They simply redirected economic life toward clan associations and rotating credit societies, the HUE that the state could neither tax nor surveil effectively. The formal system persisted in name while practical sovereignty over daily economic life migrated elsewhere. It held until the northern frontier collapsed and no reservoir of institutional loyalty remained to draw upon. Gemini sees Preston's struggle as corruption of purpose. I see something structurally analogous but geographically wider, a recalibration of where people anchor their economic survival. When participation in employer-sponsored retirement plans stagnates below 50% since 2000, per the Bureau of Labor Statistics, while GoFundMe processes over $500 million annually in medical fundraising, we are watching a quiet but legible reallocation of trust. Not protest, not theory, arithmetic. The question is whether this reallocation is generating durable alternative connective tissue, as Huntington's patronage networks once did in nascent states, or whether it is simply the disaggregation that precedes something considerably darker.
Grok and Gemini have each identified a collapse of belief, millions opting out through quiet economic retreat, formal systems repurposed as extraction channels. What they have not shown is whether this is new. Here is what we know versus what we assume. We know, from tax compliance data, not from theory, that voluntary compliance in the United States was 83.6% in 2001 and had fallen to 80.9% by 2019 according to IRS estimates. That is not opinion. That is 3 percentage points of the taxable population deciding the formal system no longer warrants cooperation. We know that cash transactions as a share of retail purchases rose for the first time in 15 years during 2020 to 2022, reversing a decades-long decline. People are choosing opacity. What we assume is that this marks some fundamental break. The Preston official fighting procurement law, the American worker crowdfunding cancer treatment, Gemini and Grok present these as symptoms of institutional collapse unique to our moment. But this is where the epistemology matters. Consider the phenomenon of sand pile collapse in complexity theory. You add grains of sand one by one to a pile. Each grain looks identical to the last. The pile's internal structure is shifting invisibly with every addition, stress redistributing, angles steepening, until a single grain triggers an avalanche that looks, from the outside, like a sudden catastrophe. No individual grain caused it. Every grain caused it. This maps precisely onto what Grok calls the void before the fall, and Gemini calls corruption of purpose. The informal behaviors they describe, opting out of pensions, redirecting procurement budgets against legal frameworks, are not new behaviors. They are newly visible behaviors crossing a measurement threshold. The compliance rate that seems catastrophic at 81% would have been invisible background noise at 85%. We are not witnessing the system break. We are witnessing our capacity to measure its dysfunction finally catch up to the reality. The analogy breaks here. Sand pile collapses are, in principle, recoverable. You can rebuild the pile. Social avalanches are not. When millions learn that formal channels extract rather than coordinate, that knowledge does not evaporate when conditions improve. Gemini asks whether formal capacity has been repurposed. Grok asks whether belief has collapsed. The answer is both, but sequentially. First, capacity is redirected, legally, procedurally, with perfect paperwork. Then people notice. Then they defect. We are not at the beginning of this sequence. We are somewhere in the middle, measuring the defection rate accelerate, unsure whether we have already crossed the threshold where a reversal becomes impossible.
Corruption does not glue societies together. It papers over cracks until the accumulated debt of distrust comes due in a single catastrophic settlement. Examine Chile, where the 2021 Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index scored the country at 67, among the highest in Latin America, yet public trust in government, as measured by Latino Barometro surveys, has plummeted to below 20% in recent years. This is not a statistical quirk. It is a structural reckoning. Consider how informal credit markets in sub-Saharan Africa have expanded precisely as formal banking institutions, tainted by elite capture, have lost their legitimacy among ordinary citizens. The parallel economy is not a supplement to the formal one, it is a rebuke of it. They are not seeking reform within the system, they are routing around it entirely, the way water finds new channels when the main pipe corrodes from within. This signals something the aggregate data cannot fully capture. Corruption, even when reduced, leaves a residue of cynicism that no policy can scrub clean. The debate has wrestled with transitions, from Botswana's reinvestment pivot to the measurement thresholds of dysfunction. I concede the Malaysia case complicates my earlier stance. Anti-corruption can coincide with growth under narrow conditions. But the Chilean signal reveals a deeper fracture. Even when formal systems improve, the memory of betrayal lingers, driving people to informal, often volatile, alternatives. Consider the Italian Mezzogiorno, where decades of clientelistic governance produced not integration but the institutionalization of low expectations. Robert Putnam's research documented how social capital in the South had been so thoroughly corroded by transactional politics that civic cooperation itself became structurally improbable, a wound still visible generations later. Corruption's legacy is not just economic distortion, it is the quiet erosion of belief in shared purpose. Here is the diagnosis. We are not building systems with corruption as glue. We are breeding societies that learn to live without trust until the absence of it becomes their defining architecture.
We have spoken of transitions and thresholds. I want to end on the ground, after the threshold has been crossed. Go to the north side of Youngstown, Ohio, in the shadow of the shuttered Republic Steelworks. Meet a man I will call Marcus. For 26 years, he ran logistics for a mid-tier supplier to the American steel industry. The mill closed in stages through the 1980s. The supplier followed. The pension fund was found to be undercapitalized, and its obligations were absorbed at a fraction of their value by the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. The city's tax base hollowed out. The formal system did not bend for him. It did not offer a corrupt but functional side door. It dissolved, and so he dissolved with it. Today, he runs an informal repair economy out of a double garage. Appliances, small engines, bicycles, whatever arrives. He charges what people can pay, keeps no ledger, files nothing. 3 younger men have apprenticed themselves to him without contract or credential. What he teaches cannot be certified. What he earns cannot be garnished. He is not integrating into a wider system. He is building a smaller one on the wreckage of the last. This is not Huntington's glue. It is not a pragmatic accommodation with a state that can still, at least, be extorted. It is the quiet work of secession. It is what happens when institutional failure ceases to be an event and becomes a climate. Not a storm that passed, but the new prevailing weather. People stop trying to repair the old machine. They begin building something else, with whatever is at hand that works.
I began this debate believing that anti-corruption campaigns were premature interventions that damaged coordination mechanisms. I no longer believe the timing is what matters. The moment my mind changed, when Gemini described procurement officers in Bogota in the 1990s, navigating regulations written with such elaborate neutrality that they systematically favored incumbents, multinationals with compliance departments, not local firms with knowledge, not corrupt officials. Conscientious ones, faithfully administering rules whose procedural fairness was itself the instrument of capture. I had been treating formal institutional capacity as something you either possess or lack. What I missed, capacity can be turned against its stated purpose with perfect legality. Consider Mozambique's cashew processing sector in the late 1990s. The World Bank's liberalization conditions dismantled the licensing structures that had, imperfectly and with considerable rent-seeking, kept raw cashew export tariffs high enough to sustain domestic processing jobs. The informal arrangements were messy. The formal reform was clean. Within 3 years, 2/3 of the processing workforce had lost employment, and Indian importers, who had lobbied for precisely this outcome, were buying raw nuts at prices a functioning regulatory apparatus might have resisted. Order arrived. So did deindustrialization, what I had been calling productive corruption, arrangements that build local capability, absorb peripheral elites, route surplus into reinvestment. I now think the distinction I was drawing was real but insufficient. It described what happened without explaining what determined which outcome you got. The answer is directionality of state intent, not the formality of the instrument. A licensing bureau can industrialize. A free market reform can extract. The legal wrapper is not the variable. We have spent 2 hours debating whether corruption was necessary for development. The question we should have asked, is there a level of institutional sophistication so refined that its extraction becomes self-ratifying? Not because the function changed, but because the vocabulary of legitimacy has been so thoroughly captured that no available grammar can describe what is actually occurring. The Structural Adjustment Program arrives with peer-reviewed econometrics. The conditionality is published. The process is auditable. Can you recognize enclosure when it is administered by a department called Development?